Hello and welcome. How truly accountable are the world's most powerful leaders when they are accused of serious crimes in office? For the longest time, heads of state largely avoided prosecution, but over the past 2 decades, a new trend has emerged. Since 1990, at least 67 former presidents or prime ministers have been formally prosecuted for serious human rights violations or economic crimes. Before that, only a handful of leaders had to answer for what they did. On Monday, Peru's Supreme Court convicted former President Alberto Fujimori on charges of embezzlement and sentenced him to 7.5 years in prison, his third conviction in less than 2 years. At The Hague, the former Liberian President Charles Taylor is currently facing 11 counts of murder, torture and recruiting child soldiers during Sierra Leone's civil war. That's taking place at a special UN-backed court. Taylor is the first African head of state to be brought before an international court for war crimes. Sudan's current president, Omar al-Bashir, was indicted in March by the International Criminal Court on charges of crimes against humanity in Darfur, the first time a sitting head of state has been charged. But Mr. Bashir is ignoring the court's warrant and has travelled internationally several times to African Union countries which have said he would not be arrested upon arrival. Some wonder whether the jurisdiction for international criminal courts could ever extend to the leaders of powerful developed nations such as the United States, especially since the US, Russia and China did not sign the treaty that created the ICC. On today's show, we look at the rise in international criminal courts and ask, can these special tribunals really bring about justice and accountability, or are they losing effectiveness by overstepping their capacities? Remember, you can join our conversation with your questions and comments. Log on to livestation.com/AJE, enter the chat room, and you can take part. And of course, you can always phone into the show with your calls. Joining me today from New York to discuss these issues is Caitlin Reiger, Deputy Director of the Prosecutions Program at the International Center for Transitional Justice, who recently co-authored the book Prosecuting Heads of State. She has worked on post-conflict justice initiatives in several countries and was previously a senior legal advisor to the judges of the Special Court for Sierra Leone. From Boston, we're joined by Lisa LaPlante, founder and director of FujimoriOnTrial.org and co-founder and deputy director of the Praxis Institute for Social Justice in Massachusetts. She has spent many years in Peru working with its Truth and Reconciliation Commission in various capacities. Here in Washington, D.C. with me is Colin Thomas-Jensen, a Truman Security Fellow and political analyst, policy analyst specializing in Africa with the Enough Project, a non-profit that works to prevent genocide and crimes against humanity worldwide. I welcome you all to the show, and Caitlin Reiger, if I could start with you and ask, it's something I guess a lot of people wonder, is there really anything such as, international justice? I mean, justice at an international level, where there would be such a thing as an impartial world court?
Well, I think, Riz, there definitely is a sense of global justice now and a system of international justice. I think, though, it's more than just seeing it in terms of whether or not there is a single institution that applies. Obviously, we do now have the International Criminal Court, and that's a major step forward. But the system of international justice is broader than that, and it ranges from mixed national international tribunals like the Special Court for Sierra Leone right through to domestic jurisdictions using international law in their own courts.
Well, Caitlin, let me put a question we got from one of our viewers through Facebook. Rasha Hamad wrote in through Facebook saying, it would be interesting to know what criteria are used for prosecution. Would these criteria apply to all heads of state across the board? What countries are in the position to judge? Can one hope for equitable international justice knowing that there is only one superpower today?
Look, the criteria depend very much on the particular judicial forum you're talking about. And each court has its jurisdiction defined in terms of who it's able to target, what crimes it can look at, what time period, and so on. The International Criminal Court's jurisdiction is limited to those countries primarily that have signed up to the Rome Statute, or situations such as Darfur, where the Security Council of the UN has referred the situation to the court.
Well, let me put to Lisa LaPlante then, there in Boston. Who makes the judgment on what is justice at an international level? I mean, can there be a set standard for all, in your opinion?
The issue with who makes the decision about justice at the international level, I think, inevitably is linked to the national level. Most of my experience has been within Peru, where the local population has demanded some form of justice. So a lot of the procedures that go on nationally influence the international attention to justice.
So Lisa, what example do you think, what standards were set with the recent Fujimori trial and that conviction?
The importance of the Fujimori judgment, I think, goes towards the the impact of a country in transition that actually opts for criminal justice as a part of its transitional justice experience. In the case of Peru, they were able to get a judgment from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights to annul their amnesty laws that were put in place in 1995 by Fujimori. And through that help from the international system, they were able to include criminal justice in their whole transitional justice process, including the Truth Commission making recommendations for criminal trials.
Well, Colin, Thomas-Jensen, good to have you here as well. I guess one of the biggest criticisms people have, and it's one that's come up a lot with our viewers with their questions and comments to us over a period of time, is that it seems the leaders of the most powerful nations are invulnerable, that while those in developing nations are essentially an easy target, particularly in places like Africa. And I wonder what you make of that effort, for example, to indict President Omar al-Bashir of Sudan.
Well, I think the reason why Bashir has been indicted, I mean, there's a few big reasons. Number one, there's overwhelming evidence of crimes against humanity committed by his government and proxies, proxy militias. If you're in denial of the crimes that were committed in Darfur, you've been living in a cave. It's very serious crimes, and that's the reason why the UN Security Council opted to refer the case to the International Criminal Court. If you look at
the first time since it's been a sitting head of state, when things like this have happened elsewhere, no one ever has gone past, for a sitting head of state.
That's correct. I think the case of Darfur was special in a couple of ways. One, I mean, it met the ICC's jurisprudence. You had a situation where a country was unwilling to prosecute war crimes committed within its borders, and this is where the Security Council, the International Arbiter of Peace and Security, stepped in and said, well, we need to introduce accountability to the situation.
I'm going to give you a question here from Colin, from our viewers that came in by Twitter. Samuel Ochanji in Nairobi in Kenya wrote in saying, who will haul Bush, Sharon or Livni, talking about some of the Israeli leading figures, to The Hague? International justice pursues leaders of weak nations but somehow expects powerful nations to regulate their own leaders. It's a two-tier justice system. Do you get that impression it really is a two-tier system?
I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think certainly there's been arguments made about crimes committed in Iraq by the Bush administration, crimes committed in Gaza, for instance, by the Israelis. But the ICC is, in the Gaza instance, is looking into that situation. There have been investigations, and we'll see how it moves forward. In the case of the United States, I think we've seen here in this country the debate over how to deal with the fact that the previous administration was engaged in acts of torture. It's ignited a very vibrant debate in this country about how these issues play out. And I think the International Criminal Court and others are watching this debate for signs of how the U.S. is going to handle its own transitional justice issues.
Well, Caitlin Reiger, it's interesting that the International Criminal Court's really quite a new phenomenon. It's only been going a few years. I wonder how effective you feel that the various ad hoc international criminal tribunals have been, such as the one set up for Rwanda, there was one set up for the former Yugoslavia.
Look, I think they've been extremely effective in some areas, particularly in the development of international criminal law, specifying what really does constitute crimes against humanity, recognising for the first time that rape can be an act of genocide. And those things have made an enormous difference to both developments at national levels as well as influencing what is now the basis of the International Criminal Court. But those courts have also made, I think, significant symbolic achievements and real achievements in terms of justice for the countries that they deal with. The ICC's indictment of al-Bashir is in fact not the first time that a sitting head of state has been indicted by an international court. Milosevic was still in power at the time that the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia indicted him. Similarly, Charles Taylor was still in power in Liberia when the Special Court for Sierra Leone indicted him. And so I think these courts have all been part of the broader process.
Well, actually, Lisa LaPlante, the interesting question, I guess, is if there is a process for international prosecution, even if there is that process, what's the impact of legal restraints that may come up during trial and sentencing, such as limited number of charges, protection for the accused, favourable confinement, or even, perhaps the inability to touch assets if they're needed?
I think one of the most important things about holding heads of state, whether former or current, is the idea of due process. Essentially, you're trying to rebuild the rule of law And so assuring their due process guarantees is one of the most important aspects of this process. In the case of Fujimori, he was given every type of due process protection, including recesses for his health, assuring defense. And so whether it's a limit, perhaps, in terms of what evidence can come in the types of procedures that are permitted is important, because essentially you're establishing the principle of due process for all people.
Let me get a caller in from Washington, D.C. Victor's on the line. Victor, what would you like to ask?
My question is, why is it taking so long to give Kenya a lot of chances for the criminals that caused all the mayhem in Kenya to be prosecuted in The Hague?
Okay, let's. I'll put this to Colin. Actually, I mean, looking at the situation in Kenya, of course, you're familiar very much with the situation in Africa.
Absolutely.
How do you judge the situation going on there?
Well, Kenya's in a very difficult spot at the moment. The Kofi Annan, who helped to mediate the peace agreement that led to a collaborative government, has handed over names to The Hague, sealed names of people that he believes are responsible for war crimes. Now, at this point, it's up to the Kenyan government to put in place a system to try and prosecute war criminals for the extraordinary acts of violence that occurred in the wake of the election. If they don't do that, if they demonstrate an unwillingness or an ability to do so, that's when the ICC would step in.
So there has to be a system, a process before.
Exactly. The ICC is a court of last resort, and until the Kenyans demonstrate that they're unwilling or unable to prosecute, the ICC will remain on the sidelines.
Well, a call from South Africa. Mohammed, what would you like to add to the conversation?
Yes, I'd like to ask your panel a question. Is that why has it taken the West so long to try and bring Israel to justice when she has blatantly, ignored international calls on all aspects, including the return of the refugees? I mean, is that not a blatant violation of human rights?
Well, Mohammed, what we're going to do, we're going to look at that question in just a moment. We're going to take a very short break here. I'll ask my guest to stand by. As we pause, let me remind you, you can join the conversation with your questions and comments by logging on to livestation.com and entering the chat room. You can see the debates taking place in there right now. We'll be right back.